The Awakening, from the Fempiror Chronicles, by George Willson. Chapter 5, Secret Rendezvous. David swept another round of dirt out of the shop and onto the ground outside the alley door. As with the shirt dyeing, a task he had finished only moments before Mr. Franklin returned, sweeping the store at the end of the workday was David's responsibility. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked back into the shop. The tailor's shop was divided into two sections. The front half contained mirrors and chairs for his father and brothers to measure their customers and to make marks on the fabric they were going to cut, sew, and alter to the whims of these patrons. The back of the shop, separated from the front by a line of mirrors, contained tables and chairs for the actual work, as well as a few bolts of cloth made by David's mother and some of the other women of the town. He mused for a moment that Beth would probably join those ranks someday as well. Jonathan entered the back of the store and walked over to David. David figured he was probably going to receive a lecture over standing instead of sweeping. "Mr. Franklin was really pleased with your work today, son," Jonathan said. David was surprised, but then his father never held back on compliments and praise when they were due. "Thank you, Father," David said with a smile. "However," Jonathan began. "Here it comes," thought David. "I found the dye to be rather uneven on the second shirt," Jonathan continued. "You rushed through the process too quickly. You should have known he would leave them here to dry fully. You need to pay attention to what you are doing and take your time when time is needed." "I'll be more careful," David assured him. "Good," Jonathan said. "People's clothes are their first impressions. It's important they be done right." David felt like he could recite these little sayings of his father even before his father could spout them out. Again. Mark emerged from the front of the store, a look of worry on his face. This was where his father's words were to go hypocritical. "Where did I go wrong on that waistline, Father?" Mark asked. "It was 2 inches. Anyone can make a mistake," Jonathan assured him. And that was it? David was shocked. He was criticized over uneven dye, but Mark can ruin someone's clothes and get nothing more than a "don't worry"? "Isn't this the third alteration he's done wrong?" David asked, as more of a reminder, he thought. "David, this is not your concern," Jonathan shot back angrily. "Yes, sir," David said in defeat. "Of course it isn't," he thought. "It never is. It never will be." "Now, finish sweeping the floor," Jonathan finished before leaving the back of the store. David sighed and continued sweeping. He wondered if, perhaps, his father would even miss him if he just disappeared. Several hours later, after closing the store and having dinner, Jonathan Taylor sat in a comfortable chair in the living room of his house, with a few sheets of parchment and a charcoal pencil in his lap. He sketched clothing ideas each evening as recreation after dinner, while his wife, Mary, cleaned up, and his sons wound down from the long day's work. His latest sketch was of a man in a pair of breeches and a shirt. This was often where he began before trying to make something more of the common theme of men's clothing. Naturally, he never made any of the alterations he had created over the years. People did not embrace change easily, and changing something as significant as someone's clothing was not something that he felt was his place to do. Changing it up as he sat in the privacy of his own home, however, furthered his appreciation of the simplicity of the original design, although he occasionally did find an easier way to make the old standard. His sons were being productive as well. 2 of them, anyway. His eldest, James, sewed a series of buttons on a dress Mary had nearly finished for one of the women in town. She had laid it aside to cook dinner, and James had offered to do some of the finishing work on it for her, which made his father proud. His middle child, Mark, was busy carving a wooden needle, something Mark had recognized that they were in short supply of earlier. Mark did try hard, but Jonathan wondered if he would ever fully understand their business, since frustration with Mark's work had begun wearing on the customers, as well as he and James. And then there was David. His youngest son sat idly on a chair and looked out the window. Jonathan worried about him. He seemed to be in a constant state of distraction, never focusing on his duties to the point of mastering them, but only barely getting by. Jonathan worried that perhaps he was not challenging the boy enough, but at 17 he should have enough focus to dye a simple shirt. Without complete mastery of the basics, how could he allow David to move on? Besides, with 2 other sons working the family business in a small town that needed more repairs than new garments, there was not enough work for 3 of them. This left David with the tasks that they did not have time to complete, and then anything Jonathan could give him to keep him busy. He would not have one of his sons look idle. He sighed and looked back to his sketch. He was pondering a way to make the same shirt and breeches combination they always had, but perhaps a way to use fewer stitches or less fabric, or even make their old shirts cooler in the summertime. He shook his head. "James, come here," he called out. James quietly put his needle down and walked over to Jonathan's chair. "Yes, sir," James said. "This design needs something, and I can't place it," Jonathan said. "Do you have any thoughts on maybe making it cooler?" James looked at the drawing Jonathan had done. James had an eye for design that Jonathan lacked, and James often impressed him with new variations that he had never considered. "What if you cut the sleeves off here?" James said, pointing at a point between the shoulder and elbow on the drawing on the right arm. "And here," he finished, pointing at the left side. Jonathan looked at the page, and then drew a line to make the shirt short-sleeved. Simple enough, he thought, but merely cutting the sleeves off had never occurred to him. "Short sleeves?" he asked his son. He looked at the page again. "Huh," he said, amused. "That's it. You're really starting to surpass me." He laughed, proud of his oldest son, and set to making this idea a reality on the page. Imagine what people would think about the Taylor family showing up with their lower arms cooled off in the summer. Everybody would want one. James returned to his buttons, and then Jonathan became aware of his youngest son standing next to his chair. He continued his work on the drawing. "Father," David said. Jonathan did not look up. He was certain whatever David wanted would benefit only David, and not the family or the business. "What is it, David?" Jonathan asked. "I was wondering," David said, "if it would be permissible for me to see Abraham and Beth tonight." Jonathan stopped. He lowered his parchment and looked David square in the face. He noticed that even Mark and James had stopped what they were doing to see this answer. He knew David was close to Abraham and Beth, and they spent a lot of time together. He also considered that it would be unlikely for them to have any problems in a group, but he could not set an unfavorable example of allowing his son to break the current mayoral restriction. "David," he said, "the mayor has banned all activity after dark until this business with Ben Thurman has been cleared up." David scoffed. "Surely you don't believe the unholy demon story," he challenged. Jonathan smiled. His family was well aware of his feelings about Barleyman Witt's version of what happened to Ben, and from a more personal standpoint, he felt that the people of the town were off their nut for lending the least amount of credibility to the tale. "Nonsense, as far as I'm concerned," Jonathan said truthfully, "but the mayor doesn't want to take any chances. The law is the law, and we follow it. Are we clear?" David looked into Jonathan's face for a while, as if expecting some other secret answer, but Jonathan was wholly aware of James and Mark also not breaking their glances. And as he said, the law is the law, so this answer could not change for any reason. Jonathan gave no indication that he would change his answer either. His face remained humorless and serious. Finally, David nodded, looking dejected. "Yes, sir," was all he said, before turning to the stairs. Jonathan watched his son, and wondered if he were really going straight to bed as he appeared, or if he would climb out his window, as Jonathan was well aware he had done before, though he never let his son know that he knew. He was young once too, and even suspected there was more to his son's life than David had ever said. With as much time as Elizabeth Carpenter had been spending with his wife lately on spinning and learning the mantua trade, he wondered if there was more between them than either was willing to admit. His wife appeared out of the kitchen in time to see David heading up the stairs. A warm feeling passed Jonathan's heart. Mary Taylor was a homely woman who looked average to everyone except him. She was the queen of his household, and although she looked tired after her long day, she was still more than radiant in his eyes. She loved this house, her family, and the life she had helped Jonathan make for them. He knew she was happy that Miss Carpenter had been willing to learn her trade, since they had no daughters to apprentice into it. "Are you going to bed already, David?" she asked. David paused on the stairs and looked back at her. "Forgive me, Mother, but I feel as if the day has worn me out," David said, a little too unconvincingly for Jonathan's taste. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked. David shrugged. "I'm just a little tired," he said. "I'll be fine tomorrow. With your permission, I do wish to rest." "Very well. Good night, David." "Good night, Mother." David turned back to climb the stairs. Jonathan felt he had better say something so David would know he is no fool to his son's movements. "If you are going to bed, then I'd best find you there when I come up later," he said. "Are we clear?" David looked back at him. Was that a hint of concern? "Yes, Father," David finally said, nodding. "Good night." "Good night, son," Jonathan said. David walked up the stairs, and Jonathan could hear his door close. Jonathan went back to his sketch before he noticed that his wife was at his arm. He put the parchment down and looked at her. He knew that look. She thought he knew something she did not. "What was all that about, husband?" she asked. "Don't worry about it," he replied, and went back to his sketching. She only stood there for a moment before walking away again. Jonathan truly hoped David would not do what he feared he would tonight. Regardless of Barleyman Witt's explanation of Ben Thurman's fate, Jonathan believed that something had happened, and he did not want the same to happen to his son. David opened the window of his room on the second story of the Taylor house. He looked down to the ground only about 8 feet below his window, a clean drop. He glanced back at the closed door of his room and the pillow he had placed in his bed to simulate someone under the covers. He knew it would not fool his father, but he hoped it would hold him off long enough for David to get back. David leaped out his window and landed softly on the ground. He had done this many times before, and so the leap was second nature to him. He glanced back to the house behind him to ensure no one had heard his escape before running off into the slowly dimming evening. He ran along the row of houses on the west side of town to a grove of trees just to the north and west of the town square. Here the trees grew very tightly together, and as the town had not reached into this part of the land, there was never a need to disturb them. Within the trees there was a small opening that David had discovered when he was younger. It opened up within the trees to an area about the size of an average bedroom. He and Beth often met here first, before making their way to more distant places, after they had found that they were so close to some of the houses on this side of town that the people in them could overhear their conversations when they talked at length. "Beth," David said in a whisper once he was in the small grove. "Beth, are you here yet?" In the dimming light, the grove had grown pitch black. It only gave them another reason to move elsewhere, since they were unwilling to light a candle within the brush here. "My love, you made it!" Beth emerged from deep within the trees. It was so dark that she was invisible even as close as she was to him. She practically jumped into his arms, and their lips touched briefly but passionately. "Shall we go?" David asked. "Please," Beth replied, and they ran out of the trees and behind the row of shops and houses on the north side of the town towards the east. Their destination was the old mill, of course, and he hoped that Ben would not be there this time. In fact, he suspected that someone had gone out there already just to see if Ben did end up there, but it was hard to be sure. The town looked after its own, but many people also expected someone else to do that for them. Typically, someone else ended up being no one at all. They slowed to a brisk walk once they were out of the town proper, and looked to the mill only a few hundred yards ahead of them. Their hands clasped as they walked. David suspected what Beth was going to talk about when they got there. She had been pressing harder and harder for an end to the secrecy they had been keeping, and perhaps it had finally come to a head with her. The old windmill was a tall gray brick structure with a thatched roof and large props covered in tattered white cloth that still spun when the breeze hit them right. Mrs. Miller had left several years ago when Mr. Miller had died after falling from the top of the tower on the inside. While Mr. Miller had been a resident of Hogginstown for many years, he was the last of his family, and he had met Mrs. Miller while selling his extra wares in another town. After he died, Mrs. Miller had no one in Hogginstown, so she had taken their 2 children and gone to live with her family, leaving the mill to the elements. No one had ever had the desire to assume Mr. Miller's trade or live in the house where he had died, so it remained on the open fields for whoever happened to come by. David opened the door to the mill, which was never locked even when Mr. Miller was alive, and looked inside. Dust and cobwebs covered everything. Parts of the roof had fallen through, exposing the inside of the mill to the elements and the darkening night sky. The remaining light shone through the opening, more than sufficiently illuminating the inside of the structure. The mill wheel still moved slightly since the assembly was still attached to the outside prop. David and Beth closed the door behind them and stepped in quietly. A set of recent footprints marred the perfect dust cover, so David suspected someone had been out here recently. "Hello," Beth called out. "Anyone here?" David added. They paused for a moment, listening to the sounds of the night echo in through the open roof. David smiled. Nothing. The mill was completely silent. He looked at Beth. "It looks like our secret is safe," he said. "Good," she said, "because we need to talk." David walked to the mill wheel, brushed the dust away, and sat down to listen. Beth paced for a few moments. It looked like she was trying to gather her thoughts together. "This is about us, isn't it?" David prompted. It was an obvious question. Why else would they have come all the way out here? Any other conversation could be had anywhere in town. Beth nodded finally. "At first, the secret was fun," she began, "and then necessary so we could see each other without being trailed by family." She stopped and looked at him. He could see the longing in her eyes. "But David, it's getting old," he finished for her. Even he was feeling this way lately. "We're both old enough to be married," she continued, "and no one would object. What are we waiting for?" "Well, before now it was the fear of being watched all the time, like young couples tend to be," he said. "Of course, if anyone learned of this rendezvous, we'd be lashed either way." "If we get married, we'll be free to be together whenever we want," she said, "and the only thing we'll be watched for is grandchildren." David smiled and held out an arm. She sat in his lap, and he held her. He could tell she was worried about what he would say. Maybe she was afraid he felt they were not as ready as she thought they were, but Beth had been with him almost his entire life. There was no reason he could not hold her for the rest of it. In fact, the thought of not having her by his side did not even seem like an option. At 17, they were still younger than most people were when they got married, and it was even more unusual when the man was not considered a master of his trade. He could not establish how they would live, considering how little he was involved in the heart of the family business. He understood it well enough to move up, and if he was going to be married, it would change his status in the family enough that it might force his father to teach him the parts he was longing to learn. That is, if both of their fathers approved of the match. "Whenever you want to tell, I'm with you," he said. "Really?" she squealed with delight. She hugged him tightly and then jumped to her feet, pacing again, but excited this time. He watched her with rapt attention, enjoying her mood. "Well," she said rapidly, as if she had been planning this as well, "I think I'd want the wedding next spring, so I think probably in a couple weeks we could reveal ourselves and allow a natural courting period." Her pacing area widened across the floor of the mill. The rotten planks of the wooden floor creaked beneath her feet. David found it almost difficult to keep up with her. She moved toward an outside wall. "You would, of course, have to ask my father for his blessing, but that should be easy." Easy for you to say, he thought with a shiver at the idea of approaching the formidable Patrick Carpenter for something as precious as his daughter's hand. Beth never stopped for a second. Then we could begin the actual planning process. But she was cut short. The wooden floor had rotted to the breaking point and collapsed under her. With a scream, she disappeared completely under the floor of the mill. "Beth!" David screamed. He was understandably panicked. He ran to the open space in the floor and looked down into a deep hole. "Beth!" he called again. A faint coughing issued from inside the hole. He knew he had to follow her down into wherever this led. He was not going to have the love of his life fend for herself in the bottom of this unknown pit. He stood up and looked around briefly for rope or anything he might use to get them back out of the hole once he jumped into it. But this mill had been used for its materials over and over again to the point that there was little left of something as universally usable as rope. He looked back down the hole. "Beth, I'm coming down," he shouted. He did not relish a drop into darkness, but he had to go after Beth. He lowered his feet into the hole and let go.